Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday the 28th of August, and you're watching episode 141 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap providing insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Weather and Climate, Not All Earthly, is my guest, David Archibald. David was born in Tully, Queensland. After graduating from the Queensland University in geology, David worked in the coal and shale exploration in Queensland and oil exploration in New South Wales. A career change saw David become a stockbroking analyst, working in both Sydney and Perth for several years before becoming the managing director of the oil exploration company, Oilex. Later, he was the CEO of gold and base metal explorer, West Gold Resources, and the director of the Canning Basin oil explorer, Golden Dynasty. David has been involved in cancer research on and off for the last 25 years. And in the period since 2018, he has conducted some original cancer research, including vitro and veto work at the Curtin University, and has authored the book Anti-Cancer Garden in Australia. David began researching climate science in 2004 and has published a number of papers and books in this field. He has lectured on climate science in the US Senate and Congress. He was a visiting fellow at the Institute of World Politics in Washington in 2012. This institute is the graduate school for CIA, Department of Defense, State Department, and other agencies. David is a Supreme Court expert witness grade in 5 fields: petroleum geology, steel mill technology, cancer, fighter aircraft design, and climate science. Among other things, he now has a project in COVID. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Bill.
You're a bit of a finger in every sort of pie there. But if we can just stick with your days in Tully, maybe just starting out from there, maybe some of your misadventures in Queensland, and then how you moved through the education system and decided on geology.
Well, I was very outdoorsy in the 70s, and I thought geology would get me out of doors, and I like rocks and all that sort of stuff. Turns out I had a career that I spent most of the time in the office under fluorescent lighting. There's not much outcrop of sedimentary rocks in Australia. And but I did end up on and off in the oil industry, which I love. And I once had a 1/7 interest in an oil rig. And we drilled a number of wells in southeast Queensland. They were a bit character forming, actually, some of those oil experiences. And in the Canning Basin in northern West Australia, very remote. And it was all good fun, but it's all behind me now.
Just as a matter of interest, one of the things you did mention there in your resume, and that was shale oil exploration sort of thing. I remember back in, I was only a kid, I was only in primary school. My dad used to work up at Hill 50 near Mount Magnet, the gold mine up there.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously come across people who, all across Australia who come into mining and that. And he came home with these stories about, Australia's got a fair good reserve of shale oil in Queensland, but I've never heard anything about that. But do we have some reasonable reserves of oil as well as gas on mainland Australia?
Okay, if you go through, let's go around the nation, starting in Queensland. There's not much in Queensland. You've got the Bowen Basin, which is Permian. It's a lot of coking coal. It's a bit overcooked and structured. Inland, you've got the Eromanga Basin, which covers most of inland Queensland. That's very flat-lying, unstructured, immature. The Cooper Basin's in the far southwest corner of Queensland, and that's mostly been drained not much more to be found there. Then you go, and I don't see anything offshore, off the Great Barrier Reef. There's not much to find there. Then you got New South Wales, which is just about completely devoid of petroleum. There's no chance, really. Victoria, of course, had the Gippsland Basin, which produced about 5 billion barrels of oil. The Gippsland was a magnificent little oil basin for the amount of oil it produced and the size of the structures, and up to 70% recovery out of the rocks. Now being decommissioned. Bass Basin was an intractonic sag between King Island and Flinders Island. Only a few little structures, mostly drained now. Then you're into the Otway. The Otway I loved for a number of years, and I did find some whopping great direct hydrocarbon indicators on seismic once in the Otway Basin and other things. But it's the same age rocks, same sort of rocks as the Gippsland Basin, but it's the wrong structural style. It's very much chopped up with a lot of faults, got a high proportion of sand, which means that things aren't going to seal, unfortunately. There's still a bit of potential left in the Otway. There's nothing in the Bass Basin, in my opinion, where the Eucla Basin off between South Australia and West Australia. It's a large area, just flat-lying stuff, down to the basement, rotational faults, quite poor structuring. Then you come around into Western Australia. Offshore Perth, there's been a couple of little fields, but it's a bit chopped up for my appreciation. Then you go up to Exmouth Gulf, which is a changeover between the Permian Age rocks to the south, and then you're getting into the big Jurassic basins of the Carnarvon Basin and the Northwest Shore Ferry going up to the Browse Basin. And of course, that's been quite good. There's a hell of a lot of gas has been found there. There's some oil left. Barrow Island was an 800 million barrel in place field before they started producing it. And there's still a lot more gas and oil to be found in the Carnarvon Basin. Then you go around the top, and there's a few more big gas fields have been found and more stuff to be found. Then you're around to the northern part of off Kakadu, and it sort of degenerates a bit and just flat-lying stuff into the Gulf of Carpentaria. Now, onshore in the Northern Territory, it may be that that big Proterozoic-aged basin south of Catherine may come in as a big gas producer. Some American technology has come in. Origin had some of that acreage. There are a couple of Australian players in it, and it could be quite big. Onshore, otherwise, you're looking at the Canning Basin, and there are a few structures very much worth drilling in the Canning Basin, in the far eastern end of the basin, and at the far western end. The central part is a bit overly structured, poor source rocks. Canning Basin is a big pile of sediment, but it's sort of upside down, and the reservoirs on top, and the seals in the middle, and the source rock is the best stuff is immature. In terms of oil shale, there's a Toolbuck in Queensland, which is about 15 metres thick. I drilled it back in the early 80s, along with a lot of other people I've met who've drilled the Toolbuck formation. But 15 metres thick, probably about 140 litres of oil per tonne, which is quite a high recovery. And I think the best way to develop that would be to produce hydrogen from nuclear power plants and hydrogenate the oil shale if you can. If there's no chemical reason why to negate that. And then that's a hell of a lot of oil, because you can start at the surface with open cuts and you can go down to 1,000 metres and still be pulling oil shale out of the thing. And there are some other oil shale deposits on the eastern Queensland. And then for liquids, the biggest deposits are the brown coals of Victoria. We've got about 60 billion tonnes at least. It might be twice that number, depending on what part you're mapping, but there's a great chunk of central Victoria that has a lot of brown coal underneath it. And we could be exporting 5 to 10 million barrels a day of synthetic fuels from Victoria alone. And we certainly, if we want to have friends in the future, we should supply the Pacific with synthetic fuels from our coal. That's in it, a summary, Bill.
Very good. So we're not really energy poor. We just need to change our technology or our processes and thoughts and visions.
Well, no, I just can't believe how idiotic the whole scientific engineering community is in Australia, that we've opted for what they term renewables, but it's one way to the tip. It's not renewable. You don't get those solar panels and reprocess them to recover the metals, recover the glass, the rest of it. It's just one way to the tip after 10 to 20 years. Much the same with the wind turbines. It's only half as bad, but certainly it won't sustain civilization. You can't use power from a solar panel to make another solar panel. It'd be too expensive. All the solar panels we see around the place, on the roofs and everywhere else, an artifact of cheap Chinese coal power, are probably about 5 US cents a kilowatt hour now, possibly 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's the only reason we've got those solar panels. It's one way to the tip, and we're better off going nuclear.
Yeah, the other thing is too, there's already been a number of papers and that on the volume of rare metals and other metals you need to go down the renewable path, that, you know, to sort of suggest the world doesn't have that much in reserve to make the transition one time over. Like, you have to do everything at least every 20 years, replace your batteries, your wind turbines, and your solar panels. And the thing is, you also have to, all electricity system would go from about 37 terawatt hours to consumption to something like 57, and that's a huge, you know, increase. And I'm pretty sure there's I think it was a Swedish paper that came out and says we just haven't got, in some areas, we just haven't got the natural resources to actually fulfill that over the next 40 years. We'll run out.
Alternatively, it becomes very expensive. I was surprised how much lithium's been found this last lithium boom. There was another boom back in 2008 that only went on for about a year or two before it putted out. And I'm surprised at how much lithium has been discovered in Western Australia, for instance. In terms of all the other things, the neodymiums and the rare metals, more might come along. Copper is going to be one thing that's going to be difficult to find, because the grade of copper in Chile, for instance, has been dropping away quite readily as the years pass, and will become much more expensive. But the biggest killer of renewables will simply be the fact that for some applications, it'll be far cheaper to produce synthetic diesel and petrol, even from biomass, than try to run your tractors on electricity distributed to the countryside. There'll be part of the economy will be easily changed to batteries, but it'll be hybrids basically. For instance, the Toyota Camry in the US gets 51 miles per US gallon. That's about 20 kilometers per litre. So you can go a long way on a tank, and with people with short commutes, they probably only have to use their batteries most of the time. So it'll be a mixed economy of hybrid vehicles and purely synthetic fuel oil.
But one of the things is, it should be a market-driven thing rather than government. I think that's the real message for everyone, is let the market sort it out and technology come along to fill that market, rather than the government dictating how it will be, because we know from past history they don't pick winners very well.
Well, they also pick the ones they want to keep alive. So I noticed the price of power on the East Coast been rising steadily each year. There was a Fisher report in 2019 that predicted that Australian industry would shrink about 35% in response to the renewables push in power. But the federal government recently gave Rio Tinto a whopping great subsidy to keep its alumina smelter alive in Gladstone rather than close it. So if you're big enough, you get money under the table from the taxpayer effectively.
Yeah, well, we've seen what's happened to Germany over the last 20 years as they've pushed down this path at a much faster and harder rate than we have. And they've basically deindustrialized by about 20%. So it's not all roses and wine with the path we're going on.
Well, Angela, to call her proper name in German, Merkel, in my opinion, Merkel was a Soviet influence agent, and she deliberately destroyed the industrial base in Germany. It's as chancellor. She used Fukushima as an excuse to shut down all the nuclear power plants, and made the over-reliance on Russia to get their gas so they could even out all the power supply from the renewables. And Germans are smart people, but they just sort of wandered straight into their own horror show.
Oh, well, there's plenty of others following them, that's for sure. I mean, we've got Britain going hard and fast now. Australia seems to be on the same path. I mean, we've had Biden's anti-inflation act and that to sort of push things along. So there isn't too many clever people in the West, I don't think.
No, well, they've all been captured. The Engineers Australia, as a professional institute, a body, went green about 15 to 20 years ago, and geologists followed them. Geologists were the first of the professionals to say climate, global warming is a great nonsense, because we've seen far, far greater swings in geological time, much more rapid swings. And what we're seeing at the moment is just natural variation. And interestingly enough, the Geology Australia has been taken over by the lefties, and now say, every geologist should be digging up lithium for the new economy, and well, that sort of thing. But interestingly enough, it's now the soul of the physicists who have taken up the burden of trying to educate the public on global warming. So you had Will Happer in the 90s, but more recently there was Clausen's Nobel Prize winner in physics a couple of years ago, is giving lectures saying global warming is a great nonsense. And so is Steve Koonin, who was actually Obama's science czar, has come out. And they're basically people who are saying, I'm a scientist and I don't like this nonsense producing the reputation of science. And
well, I think Willie Soon's, you can probably Willie Soon's name amongst them as well. But the one that interests me a lot, although he's not a physicist or anything like that, but is just Lord Mockton of Beachley, but just his mathematics that he's done over the time is sort of, I don't know why that sort of doesn't make people wake up who are sort of at that level and propagating the other side of it. So, but we're going on down this path for one reason: the perception that the world is warming, and it's all caused basically by plant food emissions. So about a month or 2 months ago, I had on long time Hayden Walker, is a long range forecaster, and it was basically giving us a bit of an idea that he doesn't look at a lot at things like El Nino or the oceans or anything. It's all, he continually just, it's all to do with the sun, its cycles, its activity and stuff like that. And that's the main measure that he uses, or it seems to be the only thing that he uses. But he's sort of suggesting that the influence of the sun and its different activities that go on with the sun actually, change things like our barometric pressure and things like that, and really dictates our weather and our climate rather than much of the things that happen here on our little planet, and the activities of humans.
Yes, well, my start in global warming was 2004. A former general manager of BHP Petroleum called Bob Foster asked me to replicate the work of a German scientist, Theodore Landscheid, on the role of the major gas planets controlling the solar cycle. Now, back in those days, which is 20 years ago, we realists, climate realists, thought, well, there'll be some warming due to carbon dioxide, but won't be as bad as what the climate loonies are saying. It'll be milder. Whereas I thought, well, all the energy that stops the Earth from looking like Pluto comes from the sun, and the amount of that energy does change on various cycles. So if we can predict what the sun's going to do, we can predict climate. And that's basically what I set out to do. Now, initially, I looked at carbon dioxide and I figured out that the heating effect, someone else had done it before, but I made
Screen sharing.
It was logarithmic heating effect of carbon dioxide. So we're now up to 423 parts per million, and carbon dioxide warms the planet by about 3 degrees centigrade, but half of that heating comes from the first 20 parts per million, or 5% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere provides half of the heating effect. And from this level, at 423 parts per million, every 100 parts per million from here is only worth 0.1 of a degree. We're adding 2 ppm per year, so it's 50 years to increase it by 100 ppm. So we're only doing 0.1 of a degree every 50 years. And in 100 years' time, we'll have run out of things to dig up and burn, and then the CO2 level of the atmosphere will start dropping. Now, back to the solar influence. So about 15 years ago, I came across a paper from the Amar Observatory in Northern Ireland, which said that the solar cycle length had a bigger effect on temperature in the following solar cycle than solar cycle amplitude in that solar cycle. And I popularized that. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. That the temperature in solar cycle 24 didn't go down. It basically went sideways to up slightly. But also about the same time, there was a former B-52 bomber pilot in Ohio by the name of Ed Fix, who contacted me. And as an electrical engineer, he saw the solar cycle, and it reminded him of the ideal spring relationship in engineering, that energy is conserved from one cycle to the next cycle. And he made up an Excel file using planetary data from NASA, and he sent it to a number of other people who worked, in solar science and climate science. He got knocked back by them all, but I looked at his model, and the hindcast match was very good. So I encouraged him, and I got his first paper published in 2011. And that's the best explanation of the solar cycle I've seen. And it's basically Jupiter, which has an orbit of 11 years, and the solar cycle has an orbit of 11.1 years. And it's basically Jupiter controlling the solar cycle, modulated by Saturn. And Saturn makes it actually a lot stronger, much greater amplitude than it would be Jupiter alone or Saturn alone. And then Neptune and Uranus have a minor effect at the margins. But that explains why the solar cycle length increases and decreases, why you have preservation of energy from one solar cycle to the next. And I'm very happy with that.
I'll just chuck up a screen share here from one of your papers. there just with atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is what you're saying in regards to with atmospheric carbon dioxide is most of its heating effect is in the first 100 parts per million, and then it's a logarithmic decline after that. So basically, we started off during glacial periods about 180 parts per million, and in interglacial periods we're around about 280 parts per million. So even if we got double the 280, the actual increments that it's pushing up for warming effect is very minimal. Is that your well, that's not your proposition, but that's the science of it.
Well, interesting enough, this graph you see is based on data generated out of a program called ModTran, maintained by the University of Chicago. And it was originally developed for the US ICBM program in the 1950s, because they wanted to be able to predict the temperature of the atmosphere at various levels. And it allows you to plug in a CO2 concentration, and will tell you what the warming effect is. So I started at 20 parts per million, and bingo, 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it's basically the same as if you paint over a window. The first layer of paint takes a certain amount of light coming through, and each layer of paint has less effect until you basically can't see through it or get any light through it. And it's sort of game over. There won't be any warming from any more CO2 in the atmosphere. But the other thing to bear in mind is in that last interglacial and the depths of it, about 15,000 years ago, the CO2 level got down to 180 parts per million. Well, plant growth shuts down at 150 parts per million because the plant cells have to suck in CO2 against the gradient in the atmosphere. And of course, it's much harder for them to suck down CO2 out of the atmosphere into the stomata of the plant leaves if they've got a large gradient within the cell. So we were within 30 parts per million of life above sea level being killed off due to a lack of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And bear in mind, there are only 3 million years into the current glaciation, and the glaciation may be go on for another 10 to 20 million years. There could be a point in the future where all life above sea level gets killed off by a lack of CO2. So the higher we can take the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, the safer all life above sea level will be.
Yeah, the other thing is a lot of people point out, well, the carbon dioxide's gone into the ocean when it's cooling and that, and somehow they expect some major release of carbon dioxide as the planet warms. But a lot of other people forget that most of the CO2 that's being taken into the ocean over billions of years is turned into that thing called limestone in general, turned into this shell crabs and oyster shells and things like that. So it's not as though the carbon dioxide that's been absorbed by the ocean from the high levels when we used to have several thousand parts per million, it's not going to jump out at us. I mean, why do we have this sort of perception or these stories in regards to we've got to fear a bit of warming because we'll have a major release of methane, or we'll have a major release of CO2, and add to the greenhouse gas effect that's keeping us nice and comfortable at plus 13 degrees for the global temperature.
Well, I think there are two parts to your question, but I was going to mention the CO2 concentration in the oceans, which is about 50. There's 50 times as much CO2 dissolved in the oceans as exists in the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is in equilibrium with the oceans over 800-year time frame, but in the short term, it's in equilibrium with the ocean above the thermocline. which across most of the planet is about 100 meters down. And there's virtually no mixing in seawater above the thermocline with water below the thermocline. And in fact, submarines use that to bounce sonar off the thermocline or stay below the thermocline so they can't be detected with sonar. And they shoot their torpedoes underneath the thermocline so that the boat they're firing at can't hear the torpedo approaching until it comes up through the thermocline. So it's a big thing. Now, every 800 years, the oceans turn over and there will be equilibration between the atmospheric level and the deep oceans. That's why the CO2 level of the atmosphere is going up at the moment. The average half-life of a CO2 molecule in the atmosphere is 5 years. It's turning over and equilibrating with the top 100 meters of the oceans very rapidly in geological time terms. And that's why it's rising, and it's not equilibrium with the total amount of the water column. Now, the second point is what's happened to CO2 that used to be at a higher level in geological time. So 70 million years ago, when the flowering plants evolved, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere was 1200 ppm. So it's 3 times what it is at the moment. So most of the things that grow above sea level, the plants that we eat and rely upon for our food supply, are actually used to having a CO2 concentration that was much, much higher. Now, what's happened in the last 70 million years is that the continents split apart. Basically, the Atlantic split off from, opened up from the Americas moving westward from Europe and Africa. Also, you had the Indian plate go into the Asian plate, put the Himalayas up, and then you had a lot of rocks got eroded and produced a lot of sodium and other things, calcium. And that, when it got to seawater, then soaks up every spare carbon dioxide molecule. But as you said, we've had in the last 50 or 70 million years had these whopping great limestone wedges develop next to the continents, and that sucked a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now we'll have to rely upon the continents actually colliding into each other again to be subducted down and to produce the CO2 from that limestone. We're looking 100 to 200 million years out to get the CO2 level back out of the ocean, out of those rocks, and where it can be used. The situation is still quite dangerous going forward in that this glaciation, which was actually caused by Antarctica moving over the South Pole. So 20 or 30 million years ago, back in the Eocene, well, which is 40 million years ago, the sea level was 70 meters higher and the oceans were warmer, but then Antarctica drifted across the South Pole and started cooling, and then it developed ice sheet on top of the Antarctica, which is now 3,000 meters above sea level. You've got this whopping great plateau, which is a giant refrigerator for the planet, actually. So a lot of the heat from the transport from the equator going down to the poles, the Arctic Ocean is can be clear in midsummer, and you can get water between the bits of ice floating around. But the heat that goes down to the Southern Ocean gets radiated out into space much more readily. So that 3,000 meters of ice, it's far more reflective than open water or rock. And we've got that until Antarctica drifts off the South Pole. We're in for a long-term cooling as a planet. Good if you like skiing, but
the other thing is, why do humans get so easily conned? I mean, we only live a short time. We only, in geological time, we're not even here for a blink of an eye. So, but it's a constant. When nothing in the the Earth, and our planets and that are a dynamic system. And somehow we just expect, for some reason, everything what happened in the days of your grandfather is going to be the same as it is today, weather-wise. But it's never been like that. But where do we get this perception that somehow we can, A, it shouldn't be like that, and B, that we can make it like that?
Well, I've pondered this too, and I ended up with a book called The Faith Instinct by Nicholas Wade. He had been the science editor for the New York Times for some period up to the mid-90s. And possibly 20 years ago, he wrote a book called The Faith Instinct. And it seems that humans evolved to believe in a religion. And that makes us easier to cooperate as adults and have a society if we have something to believe in. Now, it used to be Christianity, and a great chunk of the population's given up on that. But it's a bit also like Moses climbing Mount Sinai, or what he did. And he came back down the hill with his tablets under his arm, and the children of Israel were worshipping golden calves and this sort of thing, and degenerated into a pagan sort of nature worship. And that is what the global warmers are doing. They have chucked out the Bible, but they cling to a little bit out of Genesis that talked about the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve despoiling the Garden of Eden, so they're chucked out, and therefore they must be punished. So our betters in the elite have developed this religion where we punish by having to build windmills and pay carbon taxes, and those windmills and solar panels are actually an outward display of an inner faith in global warming. So we had a complicated religion that used to do good things. You build orphanages and schools and hospitals, and we've chucked all that out to have something that just is a nature worship, where we fill our children full of dread that they're going to not burn in hell, but they'll burn on this planet alive. And everything they touch will die because they're bad people. So I hope that answers your question, possibly, Bill, about why we've chucked this thing over. And a lot of people don't want to listen to a scientific explanation because they would rather cling to this belief that they're bad people, or their neighbours are bad people, and that someone who drives a car down the road is a bad person, or flies a plane or eats meat is a bad person, or digs up coal. So that's my explanation for it. The good news is, we've got a little bit of time left, is that in Germany now, the Greens have lost in the last election 83% of their support. And especially with young people, now they've experienced some pain, chucking out the Green beliefs, and they're going for the AfD, which hopefully might be more sensible than the Greens.
I think that's probably the key to the correction in society, is that it's fine when it's just talk and virtue signaling and things like that, and someone else is suffering the pain. But when the pain is visited on, especially on our major cities in regards to the hip pocket, costs, restrictions, the possibility that they might not be able to turn the lights on, it does trigger an opportunity to make them have a rethink and say, well, maybe you don't want to keep believing in this because it's going to be a bad experience.
Yes. Well, what should replace from here is decent scientific analysis and all that sort of stuff. But on coal, I commend the concept of conserve to convert, that we do need to move away from fossil fuels at some stage. One day we'll run out of coal, and better off having that all sorted out now well, we've got a high standard of living, then trying to do it as costs are going through the roof. And of course, it'll be nuclear energy, but I believe it'll be the better source of nuclear will be a fast breeder reactors rather than the current U-235 burning light water reactors. It'll get 100 times the energy out of the uranium resource. And there's so much uranium dissolved in seawater that could be commercially recovered when the uranium price goes up, which it will do when we run out of our terrestrial stuff. But it's a happy story to be told, and it involves carbon as a good molecule. It involves hydrogen as atom, sorry, and hydrogen is a good atom, and that's and uranium, and that's what the future will be based on in terms of energy supply.
If I just bring up another slide, we'll just have a bit of a talk about the sun and what's happened over there over our recent history. This doesn't go back that far. It goes back to 65 and the last four and five sun cycles and that. But there was a lot of talk around another minimum period, especially as we went into cycle 24. That pattern of a second low, do you think that's sort of now been abated a little bit, and we might be, getting back to a more level sort of activity in the sun, or where do you think we go from here?
Well, to go back a bit in terms of solar cycle 23 was a very long cycle. It was 13.5 years long. Most solar cycles are 11 years long, and the shorter a cycle is, the stronger it is. So 21 and 22 were possibly some of the strongest solar cycles for 11,000 years. Certainly in the second half of the 20th century, solar activity was higher than it had been for the 11,000 years. Now, solar cycle 20 there was a moderately sized solar cycle, but the second half was quite cool, and there were some solar parameters like the proton flux and the AEA index were quite weak in the second half of the solar cycle 20. So there was a concept in the 70s of a cooling period, and that period now is called the 1970s cooling period. Then we had a couple of strong cycles. Now, at the end of solar cycle 23, it looked like 24 was going to be very weak, and it looked like we were going to have a repeat of the Dalton minimum, which was from 1896 to 1796 to 1816. And that was the time when the Thames froze over in central London and so on, because it was such a cold period. Now, 24 turned out to be a bit stronger than expected, but you would expect a weak cycle after a long cycle. So that's normal, but it looks like 25 will be now about as strong as solar cycle 20. And 26 will be a little bit stronger again. So I don't see a cool period from here. It's a sort of a Goldilocks period we'll go through for the next 25 years at least. Would be my expectation.
I suppose one of the other things that they commonly come out with too is, since since the start of they hook everything back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. That's when humans started to become a little bit too active in putting stuff in the atmosphere and stuff like that. But I don't think anyone would really like to go back to the way the temperatures were pre-industrial, because we're just sort of coming out of the depths of the little ice age there. Although a better name would have been, the little glacial period or something like that, because we've been in an ice age for nearly over a million years, basically. Ice age is just when there's permanent ice both in the north and southern hemisphere. I think it's a basic description of an ice age. But what do you think would it be like for the planet if we actually drop, say, 1.5 degrees back to pre-industrial temperatures and that? What would be the consequence for the world? Would it be a much better one? Of course, no, people, well, that got rid of the carbon.
No, the trouble with that sort of world is that you can have potential for excursions. So probably Canada wouldn't be able to grow wheat, for instance. If you look at the Indian corn growing region of the American Indians in the medieval warm period, into the Little Ice Age, the corn growing area went 300 kilometres south of where it is now. So Canada wouldn't grow wheat. Canada's a big producer of wheat and the like, and it would be like northern Ontario or something. It would be just a wasteland of forest. And the Corn Belt of the US is situated on soil at its lowest. It was blown in during the Ice Age and it's built up to about 8 feet of very rich soil that's perfectly flat, very well drained. It's ideal. If we got colder, then the corn growing region would shift south. They'd have to go for a shorter period of corn. Instead of being 120-day corn, it would have to be 70 or 80-day corn or something like that. And the great productivity of that corn belt region in the United States, the growing would head south into much poorer soils. And so that would happen to the US. Ukraine would probably be much the same as it is, and that part of Europe. France wouldn't be that badly affected, but certainly northern Germany across that part would be, Poland and the rest of it. And other than that, no, it's not as bad as the depth as it was 15,000 years ago, when there's 5,000 feet of ice above New York, only 15,000 years ago.
Well, I pity the generations that encounter the next glacial period. That will be a challenge for them. I mean, we should just relish the fact that we're at least in an interglacial, and it's always been a fact that a warmer climate, and if you look at the tropics, I mean that they hold more species of life. So it seems that we and our planet thrive in the warmth. Although we don't want too much, we don't want to cool, but generally it's not a couple of degrees warming isn't such a bad thing.
In terms of, there's the Pacific warm pool, which is near New Guinea, basically off New Guinea, is about as hot as you can get anything. So every 1 degree centigrade rise in ocean surface temperature increases evaporation 7%. So you'd have a much more intense tropics. And the tropics, in cooling, it would shrink, sea level will fall a bit. Venice wouldn't have to worry about being flooded. But other than that, if it warmed, great chunks of Russia would be productive, and the Russians would look forward to that. They would have this enormous belt of, there would be suddenly being able to produce stuff. But I think climate is nothing to worry about. I am concerned about the next ice age. It was going to scrape all the civilization that we built up, all the buildings, in the US, for instance, down to as far as New York, they'll all be scraped off. And then what's south of that will be simply be tundra. And we'll shrink to the equator. On the other hand, the sea level will fall 120 meters odd at its maximum. So great chunks of the South China Sea and so on will be larger areas of tropics. But
only people who I think really be upset as it got warmer was, the people who are very well off and like to go skiing.
Well, actually, I said that when one of the first lectures I gave is I said that we can look forward to longer skiing seasons with those from getting cooler. But it's pretty long now. If they've had snows in August now in North America, and they're looking forward to an early open of the ski lodges in North America. And this winter here has been cold in Australia.
In regards to moving forward, what sort of gives us any sort of hints where we're going to go as far as planetary movements and the sun's activity and that, or is it just a matter of potluck sort of thing? What happens, or is there a definite set of cycles? We know where we're going to go. Do we know when we're going to hit the next glacial period? Is there a timing mechanism sort of in regards to things like this, the tilt of the Earth, the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and the other planetary situations? Is there any clues out there of when we can expect things, or is it all unknown and people just got to say, well, carbon dioxide is going to make all the decisions?
Now let's go back a bit. The current ice age started about 2.8 million years ago, and it was due to Antarctica drifting over the South Pole. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be aware that the Milankovitch cycle exists, basically. And then the first glaciations were about 40,000 years apart. And then for the last 2 million years, they've been 100,000 years apart. And they've been coming on very regularly every 100,000 years. And the interglacials, we're in the interglacial called the Holocene at the moment. The previous one was called the Eemian, and I forget the ones before that. But a couple of them were stronger than today. 400,000 years ago was an interglacial where all the ice from Greenland melted. And so the ice sheet you see on Greenland, it's at less than 400,000 years old, whereas the one in Antarctica is much older than that, for instance. So you have these wild swings. The interglacials normally last 12,000 years. We're currently about 9,000 years into our interglacial, and temperatures have started falling. Probably about 5,000, from about 6,000 or 8,000 years ago. And it's falling at 0.25 degrees centigrade per 1,000 years at the moment in this, as we go to the end of our interglacial, before it drops off dramatically to go into the next full-blown glacial period. And we've only got 3,000 years, probably max, before that glaciation starts. Now, that's less than civilization. The pyramids are 5,000 years old, and in less time than that, we'll be heading to the equator, away from the advancing ice sheets. And other than that,
I'm almost there, so it doesn't matter.
Other than that, the solar system's 4 billion years old. The planets are 4 billion years old, and most of the orbits are set. The moon is still moving away from the Earth, so that'll change tides. But other than that, most of the rocks have been cleaned out of planetary space. And it'll be like this for another billion years or more as our sun evolves and runs out of fuel.
Well, that's one thing we've had the benefit of the ice cores over, I think ice cores in the Antarctica sort of, I think they're about 800, I think some of the cores, is that right? That the ice cores in the Antarctic that gives a hint of what temperatures were and what the CO2 levels were as well. How far did those ice cores go back?
The longest I can remember seeing is about 800,000 years. And they're pretty good quality cores. You know, they tell you how much CO2 is involved, and the temperature can be figured out from those cores, and it's dated by volcanic eruptions and all that.
But those cores have given us an indication that we've moved from, glacial to interglacial periods and the cycles that have occurred. But why would we expect even though we're sort of up the top of a interglacial thing, why do people sort of expect it just be a nice flat plateau or something like that when basically the ice cores have shown that I know the problem is that they're trying to put 800,000 years on an A4 page or that. But if you spread it out, those peaks would be a lot of bumps, ups and downs on those peaks. So why is it we just seem to be, or climate people think that the climate or temperature should be so stable for any given period?
Well, they're selling a story, they're selling a narrative, and if they told what's actually going on, they would have to find something else to do, because there would be no more government funding. That's basically why we're led astray by this. You know, the ABC goes on about it all the time, and there are a whole now raft of people in the education system who teach global warming and the rest of it. And it provides a crutch for people who need to believe in something and they default to paganism. So I've been at it for 20 years, Bill. 20 years before the mast.
I think we've still got a lot of fighting to do yet, because they seem to have the upper hand at the moment. But it does beg a belief in regards to the thing that they push is climate models and that. But even though they've got these great big whiz-bang computers, it is a matter of garbage in, garbage out and that, because if you can't put in parameters of what the clouds are actually doing and what the sun is actually doing, if you just put them as pick some sort of constant for them, it can't possibly generate an accurate picture. And to my knowledge, none of those complex climate models have even been able to hindcast the climate, let alone forecast the climate.
Well, that's true. That was recently pointed out again by that Nobel Prize winner Clausen's, who said the models don't hindcast. There's no hindcast match. And the global warmers were very clever, and because they started out with a spaghetti graph of 40 different models. For somehow these graphs all had wiggles, so they were all over the top of each other. And what's actually happened in climate since is that it's gone along the bottom of that whole panel. And this year we had the outcome of Hauka-Tonga. So that volcano in Tonga that blew up increased the temperature by about 0.8 degrees centigrade all of a sudden, because it suddenly injected a whole lot of water into the upper atmosphere. Water is a greenhouse gas, and then will eventually fall out. And so that's an interruption. Other than that, the temperature had been declining since 2016, and in line with what would you expect from the solar cycles.
No, the other thing is too, water vapor doesn't get much of a mention in the overall schemes of the global warming science, yet it is 95% of greenhouse gases. But it's basically irrelevant to climate scientists.
I was going to think, I think water may be, this is what I heard way back when, was about 90% of the 30 degrees centigrade. So if it wasn't for the greenhouse gases, the average temperature of the planet would be minus 15 degrees centigrade instead of plus 15 degrees centigrade. And most of the atmosphere around the tropics is already saturated with water, so you can't have an increased effect from water. And carbon dioxide's worth about 3 degrees or 10% out of that 30 degrees centigrade. And then methane and so on are minor things that follow up. And the reason why the global warmers get the 5 or 6 degrees centigrade that they push is that they say the carbon dioxide provides a little bit of warming, and that means there'll be more water in the atmosphere from the extra evaporation, and that provides a bit of warming, which will cause more warming, which cause more warming, and so on, and with this runaway effect until they get 5 or 6 degrees centigrade. But at the same time, they don't say why that warming should start from here, from now, and didn't start when carbon dioxide was 200 ppm or 300 ppm or something like that. It's just idiotic notion, basis for the whole belief system.
I also think the level of CO2 in regards to the historic levels of that, it still beggars belief why we try and pick a set level for it when it's sort of never been stable over history, but somehow we want it to be set at 280 parts per million, as it was before industrialization. But to my way of thinking, maybe humans have saved us from mass extinction by putting a bit of extra CO2 in now before the next glacial period. So instead of dropping down dangerously to 180 parts per million in the next glacial cycle, we have a bit of a buffer there to keep the plants going.
No, it won't work. The oceans are going to suck that carbon dioxide down, and we will never see it again. Never.
Oh,
it's a little brief period of human evolution, which we're in sort of Goldilocks time. A very
well, we can only hope. I can only hope that we sort of at least keep it up somewhere where the plants don't sort of decide to drop off, because if they drop off, so do we.
Exactly, Bill.
Just before we wrap up, we've just gone the hour of that. Can you give us a bit of a brief in regards to your cancer research of late, and where that's heading? Because that seems to be fairly interesting. Because looking at the book, the Australian Anti-Cancer Garden of Australia sort of thing, that sort of indicates there's a lot of natural opportunities from nature to sort of address some of the cancers and that. So can you give us a bit of insight on that?
Okie dokie. So let's go back into human evolution. You know, the planet is 4 billion years old. Oceans formed 3.5 billion years ago. Almost the same time, there was forms of life started, and then we had algae came along about 2.2 billion years ago, and they caused suddenly oxygen in the atmosphere, which in turn caused the primitive cells at the time to incorporate bacteria into the cell, which became our mitochondria. And that helps us cope with the oxidation from the oxygen that was suddenly into the atmosphere. We had zero. The atmosphere was 200,000 ppm, the start of life on this planet, and 80% nitrogen. And now it's tiny trace of carbon dioxide and 20% oxygen. And that's very oxidizing to most things, living things. But the replication of life, to be able for cells to be able to replicate themselves, is one miracle. But the next miracle was to do that without mutation, or have a way of dealing with the mutation. That probably didn't arise till about 1.6 billion years ago, when the animals split off from the plants. And the fungi split off from the animals only 9 million years after the animals split off from the plant kingdom, which we're talking about single-celled algae. And what I find quite interesting is that 95% of the structure of our cells to deal with mutation, that is cancer, we inherit with the plants. We've got in common with the plants. And you've only got a new molecule coming along in our own anti-cancer physiology every 50 to 100 million years, ever since about 600 million years ago. So it's been long-term system that we've shared with the plants, got from the plants. And let's jump forward now to cancer rate. So the Vietnamese prostate cancer rate is 1/40th the Australian prostate cancer rate. And the American breast cancer rate is 6 times the Japanese cancer rate, for instance. But seemingly the lowest cancer rates on the planet are in Vietnam and Thailand, and possibly other little parts of Asia. But Philippines has a cancer rate, cancer incidences for a lot of organs, much the same as ourselves. So you have to ask yourself, it's not genetic, because Japanese going to the US go to the US breast cancer rate within a generation when they go into American food. So you ask yourself, what's in Vietnamese food and Thai food that makes them have much lower rates of cancer for these things? And it's a whole lot of molecules in the Vietnamese salad, for instance. And so in theory, you could switch to that diet in part and enjoy much lower rates of prostate, breast cancer, and a few other cancers. Now, the system that nature relies upon to control cancer is called apoptosis, or programmed cell death. So each of the living cells in your body has a choice all the time of either living or dying. And if it detects itself a mutation that it can't fix, because there's a thing that goes up and down your DNA spiral and checks for mutation, and if it can't fix a mutation, it will start the apoptotic cascade of the caspases, which it sends a signal up to the cell surface, to the death receptors, and there's a molecule running around in your blood called Fas ligand, and Fas ligand will bind to a death receptor, and there are 5 different types of death receptor. And cancer is one of the most complicated subjects I've encountered, actually. And that seems signaled down through the caspases. The mitochondria are involved, and caspase 3 is the death effector caspase. It will start chopping up the cell organelles, and so the detritus can be carried off in the bloodstream rather than have the cell just sit there rotting. But that's how we grow, because we absorb cells through apoptosis, kill them off, and so the body can grow larger as from child to adult. And it's how we get rid of cancer cells. Also, most of your cells in the body have a turnover of 7 times in your lifetime. And they only stop at the end because your telomeres at the end of the DNA run out and start going. Your telomeres get chopped off every time you have a cell division. And at the end, that's why elderly people in Japan and so on, they suddenly shrink up at the end of their life because their volumes dropped. And then they just have general organ failure, and that's the best way to go. When you die in your sleep from general organ failure, as opposed to most of us Westerners who spend our lives working and then for the last 20 years in retirement, constantly battling cancers, swollen prostate, all sorts of other problems, diabetes, due to our diet and how we've departed from how we live.
I mean, but the people who frequent the doctors, and I had a partner who was ill, and you just have to go and pick up her prescriptions. And sometimes you see people come in on the little scooter or whatever, and they get loaded up with a shopping basket full of drugs, and you think, gee whiz, I don't like the idea of the volume of pills you have to take to keep going. Some people seem to be on, so much medication. It's sort of, and the other thing I understand too is if you get treated for, say, a heart condition, if taking heart medicine can affect your liver or kidneys or something like that, so you take something else, and so although you have one more severe problem, you end up taking these whole plethora of pills.
Yep. Have we got time to continue talking about cancer?
Yeah.
So, apoptosis is controlled by two things. It's a balance between pro-apoptotic proteins and anti-apoptotic proteins produced in the cell, and it's just a balance. And cancer's mutation that causes cancer is a mutation that overproduces anti-apoptotic proteins. So the only reason a cancer cell is a cancer cell is it can't be killed. It wants to kill itself. It knows it's bad, really, believe that, but it can't kill itself because it's producing too many anti-apoptotic proteins. So the system that nature produced, and it's to rely upon, is to reduce the production of anti-apoptotic proteins by evolving receptors associated with the production of those anti-apoptotic proteins. So the reason why some plant molecules have anti-cancer effects, and it's just not a happenstance of nature. We evolved to rely upon getting these things in our diet, just like we evolved to rely upon getting vitamin C. If you don't get vitamin C, you're dead in 3 years from scurvy. It turns out with cancer and so on, it just takes a lot longer to kill you, 10 to 20 years for some cancers. Anyway, so you plant molecules, there's a whole swag of them, 30 or 40, possibly beyond 100 plant molecules involved. Will bind to certain receptors on the external membrane of the cell and also on the external membrane of the mitochondria. And that will tell a switch that sends a switch to suddenly reduce the production of anti-apoptotic proteins. The system goes back into balance and the cell is able to die. And the cancer cells help this along by overexpressing beta-glucuronidase. For instance, pancreatic cancer overexpresses beta-glucuronidase relative to normal pancreatic tissue 3.6-fold. And what beta-glucuronidase is, it's a molecule that your liver gets foreign molecules. It recognizes foreign, and that includes plant molecules, and it attaches a sugar molecule to it so that the kidney recognizes it, and the kidney excretes this foreign molecule, and that's how you get rid of things. So beta-glucuronidase cuts the sugar molecule off the plant molecule, which then gets back its original activity, so it can bind to a receptor and begin the stopping the overproduction of anti-apoptotic proteins. Also, some cancer cells overexpress vitamin D receptor because they know that vitamin D will kill cancer, and so the cancer cell wants to die. So it can't do anything about a mutation that produces anti-apoptotic proteins, but it can counteract that. Now, chemotherapy starts from the other direction. If you have a mutation that overexpresses anti-apoptotic, pro-apoptotic proteins, of course the cell will die and it won't have a progenitor cell. But what chemotherapy does, it annoys the nucleus enough that the nucleus sends signals up to the cell surface to express more death receptors. More death receptors are produced and more signals come down to the apoptotic cascade caspases to overwhelm the production of anti-apoptotic proteins. So the two are complementary. Of course, that can't exist in nature, but if you get those, where most of them come from actually, from plants, and in the bark of the plants, Taxol for instance, comes from Pacific yew tree. In the bark of the Pacific yew tree to stop beetles from eating it, because that will stop cell division in the beetle, and the tree won't get chewed up by the beetle. So chemo drugs have tended, apart from the platinoids and some other things, tended to come from plants that want to stop being eaten by insects. So chemotherapy, traditional chemotherapy and radiotherapy would be synergistic with the plant molecules, because one's doing one thing in one direction, the other's doing the other in the other direction, and that's why you do have synergy between them. Generally, there's no money in it, so people don't research it, and you're not sold this as a way of curing your cancer.
Well, basically anything that sort of comes from the natural world, like if someone finds some derivative of a plant, you can't patent it. So it's not in the best interest of pharmaceuticals if you find something in nature to address any sort of medical condition, because without being able to patent it, you can't get rich.
It's worse than that, Bill, in that our TGA and the FDA in the US are also doing it, but our TGOers are having a war on vitamin D. They'll only allow 1,000 international unit capsules to be made in Australia of vitamin D. And most people in this country with an average vitamin D level of 25 to 28 nanograms per mil, they should be twice that, 50 to 60 and beyond. And you'll only get that with 5,000 international units a day or more. So they know that vitamin D would stop a lot of disease in this country. I'm not a vitamin D wacko, actually. I've done a lot of work on it.
No, I have heard stories in regards to a couple of islands around Vietnam that have some sort of plant base or something, and having that in your diet sort of cut some sort of fat levels or something. I can't remember. This is going back several years, sort of thing. And I think it was called brown fat or something like that. I'm not sure, but it did sort of indicate that there was something in regards to the Vietnamese diet that sort of gave them an advantage over us.
Yes, yeah, it's bean sprouts. I encourage people to either buy them or grow them. There's a bit of to do about it, but Woolies and Coles will sell you a kilo of mung beans for $5. Sprout them, and they're a source of the coumarins, which have an IC50 of about 4 micrograms per mil against most cancer cells lines. That's one of the best things you can do.
Oh, well, look, we've gone off topic, but it's been a good conversation. I've really enjoyed it. If I'd like to come back to you sometime in the future and just talk about I know it's a sort of not a real regional topic or anything like that, but the F31 and the current situation we find ourselves in, and then your book in regards to a solution for a defence somewhere along the line. I think that'd be a fairly interesting topic as well, if you'd like to come back sometime in the future and have a chat about that.
Certainly, Bill. Of course, I would love to.
Okay, no worries. If you can just hold on there, I'll introduce next week's show and just have a quick chat off there. And thank you very much for your time, David. Really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the night show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next Wednesday, I'll have on Phil Donato he's the MP for Orange, and we're going to talk about the subject of Mrs. Plevicek's ban on the big gold mine out that area on the basis of one person's secret women's business type thing that sort of influenced her to make a decision to cancel that mine, or at least stop it from proceeding until such time they find another site for their trailing dam, which would be a big task. It will still take several years probably to rejig the whole system. But we'll be talking to Phil in regards what impact that will have on the prosperity of the region and around Orange and Bathurst. So please join me next week. Thank you.